Welcome to the third TK Talks or Tech Talks. I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. Since this Tech Talks is from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, particularly with the GIGSA, the GI Graduate Student Association, I wanted to acknowledge that the University of Alaska Fairbanks is on the unceded territory of the Lower Dene people. The campus occupies the hill that was the original name of Chathiara. And I'm hoping that these Tech Talks are kind of honoring the history of the Indigenous peoples and the current Indigenous peoples that are here today. And today we have Kaare Erickson giving a talk called A Sharing Culture. I invited him because he has a lot of experience as a science liaison for UIC Science. And he also just defended this past summer a master's thesis in anthropology titled The Successful Engagement Between Inupiat and Scientists in Ukqiavik, Alaska, a Social Cultural Perspective, which is a lovely thesis, and I'll put the link to it. It's open access into the chat, and I will give it off to Corey.
Margaret. Whoa, some green marks. But yeah, my name is Kaare Sikuaq Erickson, and I'm really honored to be here to talk to you guys. I see a lot of recognizable friends in the room, and I see some names that new friends that I'll be getting to know. So without further ado, I will just go ahead and jump right into the talk. I apologize, I have my four-year-old son trying to break the door in. So today we'll be talking about a sharing culture. We're hoping to cover today talking about how Indigenous cultures are kind of rooted in sharing networks, kind of how they're rooted in reciprocity and sharing, and then we'll talk about how this relates to Arctic research. I apologize, I just was asked a few questions, so my mind is a little bit scattered right now, but I'll go ahead and get into the talk. So who am I? Basically, I grew up on the west coast of Alaska in Unalakleet, kind of bouncing around between the villages, as my dad was a school teacher. He was raised in Unalakleet as well, this bigger star on the map here. But I also spent a few years in Savunga as well as a few years in St. Michael, so kind of bouncing around that border between Inupiaq and Yupik and Siberian Yupik, and it's really close to the Russian side, as well as very close to the Dene groups that are right just 90 miles away from Unalakleet, where the Yukon River comes really close to the coast. So we're kind of in this, I would say, kind of melting pot, kind of this transitional zone where there's a lot of different cultures in this very close proximity. And being a mixed, Norwegian and Inupiaq and a few other things, and kind of bouncing around these villages, I kind of have that history of being kind of a cultural broker sort of thing. So I think I really like to say that my whole life kind of prepared me for this career, and in kind of being that boundary spanner that Margaret refers to in her research. I also do have a lot of ties in Shishmaref, as my Akka was born there, as well as my wife is from Shishmaref, so I have a lot of relations on both sides. And then my mom was actually raised in Utqiagvik, so that's why I work for the corporation. That's why I'm part of ASRC. And so I have kind of ties up there. So I have a lot of ties across this northern and northwest region of Alaska and the Inupiaq territory primarily. I do spend a lot of time in Anchorage, and I would like to acknowledge that this is right in the heart of Dena'ina territory, and it wasn't that long ago that they had multiple villages, and the location of where Anchorage is, it was the militarization in the 1940s that pretty much bulldozed some of those villages that kind of came in and with the Elmendorf and the Richardson air bases, and they kind of just pushed them out. And so it was relatively recently that they really had a stronghold in this area. But then I also do spend a lot of time in Whittier. I do a lot of my seal hunting, sea otter hunting, deer, fishing, through the summer. So we do a lot of resource collection in Whittier. But I kind of, normally I'm always bouncing back and forth between Anchorage and the North Slope. However, with this year being very complicated, it's really put a stop to that. I haven't been out there since March. So why is the Arctic cultures, and how are they kind of rooted in these networks of sharing? first off, it's just practical, like with the drastic seasons, as Arctic scientists, you all know that we deal with some of the most drastic seasons in the Arctic. Um, the summers as opposed to the winters, where we're forced to kind of deal with these these returns of resources that kind of come and go, and we have these short windows of time to really collect those resources. So like return and reciprocity is something that I'll keep referring to, and it's on the bottom of each slide here. Is that's at the kind of the root of our cultures, is that we really depend on kind of the return of resources every spring. We in order for that to be a reciprocal relationship, we have to really respect those resources. um, so that we, and in doing that, it requires large kind of bigger groups of people. For instance, when we have a short window of resource collection time, we're going to have, for instance, on the North Slope, I'll use that as an example, we're going to have people collecting, traditionally people are going to be collecting things on the interior, whether it's caribou skins and dried caribou meat and fish and dried fish and kind of things that you would gather in that little area. There's also going to be, at that same time, people are out, collecting, for instance, ugaruks or walrus, or making seal oil, or making rope out of the ugaruk skins, those types of things. So like simultaneously, you'll have kind of groups that are part of this bigger trading network, sharing resources. And this is kind of the traditional aspect of it. So we're kind of based in these regional, trading networks, I should say. And then we have these big trading fairs, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in the next slide. But then also safety. You are required to share resources with others. We kind of do it through trade, we do it through gifting, we do it through just basic sharing. But then even the knowledge to stay alive in these crazy environments that we live in, these rugged environments, where knowledge keeps you alive pretty much. Dangerous areas to travel throughout the year in different seasons, things to look out for, stuff that that the community it's real-time sharing network is what traditional knowledge is really based in. And those are obviously based in observations, just like scientists. And just to give you an idea of how complex these sharing networks are, and this will be kind of the theme of the talk, is that we'll talk about examples of how sharing is just at the root of our culture. And then at the end of this presentation, we'll kind of talk about how that relates to science as best as I could. So the example that I'll use, and it was just this picture on the right. A couple days ago, as I was working, maybe last week, my mom and others, they put together this, we call it Eskimo salad, or I call it Inuit salad on this slide because of some of that term. I know some people are not don't fully embrace that term, although a lot of us do out on the north and west coast of Alaska. And so it's been called historically Eskimo salad. But I'll just take that bowl of Eskimo salad right there and just kind of use that as an example of how wide these networks of sharing are, really just to make that one dish. So this is a bowl of we call Eskimo salad, Inuit salad, that I had while I was working on work last week, and it kind of dawned on me as I was emailing with Margaret about preparing for this presentation. It kind of dawned on me, I was like, this would be a good example just to talk about what's in that bowl there and what it took to have just that one dish, and the story kind of behind it. So in this dish called Eskimo salad, which is very popular just in the last week, since I was kind of thinking about this, I've had family members posting that they're eating Eskimo salad, and aunties and others. And I was thinking, I didn't gather those images, but this is kind of one of the main staples that people kind of live off of, is this salad. And in the salad, for instance, I had beluga muktuk, which was the skin and blubber of beluga whale, which is really good. And I'll just briefly tell the story behind each of these, because it's so much work, so much time, so much sharing, so much trade just put into this one little dish. And sometimes we kind of take it for granted and we don't talk about it all the time, but it's really a depth of sharing just looking at this bowl. The beluga muktuk, for instance, I was running an errand, or I was actually dropping off some fresh fish to an elder from St. Michael this summer, helping him around the house a little bit. And then when I was walking out, he said, he grabbed some muktuk. He said, hey, I just got this from St. Michael. It took hunters a lot of time and money to get to catch the beluga, to harvest it. It's a lot of work there. That's just the beluga side of it. Really, really good muktuk. Binaluk, and I probably butchered that word there because I've never seen it written down, but it's the Shishmaref term for dried ugaruk meat. And so my mother-in-law provided the what we call either black meat or dry meat or Binaluk, and that's the dried ugaruk meat that you see here. That's takes a lot of time also to go out and hunt, to harvest, to cut up. Um, it's a lot of hard work to do that, and then you'll see little pieces of blubber. That's called the dungyuk. That's also harvested alongside the ugaruk meat, and that's also put in there. The seal oil was also part of that bucket that where we got the dungyuk and the binaluk, and the seal oil all kind of comes from that same bucket. But that's a ton of painstaking work that goes into making those to harvesting ugaruks, and I mean weeks and sometimes even months of trying to hunt and even just piecing together resources to actually pull off the hunt just for just these individual resources that we have in this bowl. Smoked salmon is in there. That took us 2 weeks to go and fish and dry fish and smoke them. So that's no one thing that's in there. Salmon eggs that we got from Chitna, our family, and that's part of those 2 weeks. Dried chums that my mom provided. Like with climate change, it's really fluctuating the animal species. And this year there were hardly almost no chums to harvest in Unalakleet. So this was a very rare and especially special resource that was provided by my mom. And then the herring eggs in Unalakleet as well came from someone who had to go drive 10 15 miles, 20 miles to go and harvest it, several days of work. And then we add a lot of different vegetables to it. So just this one little dish, this one little bowl, it's just amazing how deep the work and the sharing networks are represented in these resources. And before we go further, I just like to remind folks that, as far as when you're saying food security, this is like a really practical thing. Like we live off of resources. So that we don't have to eat these like freezer burnt steaks, for instance, that cost $73. $22 a pound for beef is what they're pretty much charging at the villages where there's very few resources to kind of go around. So I mean, a lot of times our shelves are just empty in a lot of the villages, especially with the COVID-19 crisis and with Raven Airlines going down and all that. Things have gotten really complicated, and it's like it's a time where we really have to live off of the resources off the land, and that has always been the case. It's just that in these times, it even makes it more important that we're able to collect the resources. $36 for just a half of a dried out watermelon. It's really ridiculous. But at the root of all this too is the cultural component of food security and actually going out and taking part in the subsistence activities. And this is actually probably even just as important, or if not maybe even more important, that aspect of belonging that our young adults and our kids and everything they learn about this, is that they can go out and catch resources, and it really gives them a sense of belonging. It gives them a purpose. You're feeding your village, and that's what we really need, especially with the high rates of suicide and stuff like that. It's I think this is going to be the key to really showing the kids their worth. And even in the recent ICC report about food security that they put out, they really pointed that out and several times across that report. And pretty much participants stressed that being on the land, hunting, fishing, gathering, is about spending time and really being connected to the land. It gives the participants their identity. It really elevates their spirits. It grounds them and also builds relationships, with different cohorts of the family and different age groups. Something to keep in mind as well when we're talking about sharing in our cultures, in Inuit cultures, is the deep history of trade. I mean, our people were just deeply rooted in these trade networks. We had huge trade fairs. Even if some of the tribes were, maybe, or nations, as Ernest Birch would call them, these groups of people were even having wars, or fighting, there was always that truce period. In the summer, there would be a truce period where people are allowed to travel to and from trade fairs, where they weren't necessarily allowed to be killed if they're traveling through, for instance, an enemy's land. There's that kind of a common law previously that would allow people to travel to and from these big trade fairs. And we really relied on trade heavily to get kind of that whole suite of different things. Like if you're, like I said, if you're situated somewhere where you can have access to, let's say Diomede, for instance, where they always had access to the large marine mammal complex, like all year long, they're just collecting and making rope. They're famous for making there's extensive amounts of rope, and then they would able to trade that rope with somebody who had been like living in the interior during those harvest months and collecting dry fish the whole time, for instance. So then they can go and trade with someone who is making, really harvesting a lot of other things. So like the trade networks were extremely strong. The messenger feast, for instance, was a huge component to traditional life, where this is like one variation of it in a story, was that the messenger would, before they would run, like they were like professional overland travelers. They would go around to their community, and like if your community has a trading community that's kind of far in a different, located in a different place, that's utilizing different resources, a lot of times you'll have individual families or people who have trading families that have these ongoing lifelong relationships. The messenger would go around to all the different people, memorize what everybody kind of get an idea of the what people are collecting, the amount of things that people are collecting, also the things that people are expecting to trade with their trade partners, to kind of get the early communication going on. So what they'll do is they'll go around and they'll talk to everyone, and they'll get the numbers, and they'll memorize it through a dance, and then they'll go and run through the, sometimes a lot of times, enemies lands, and they'll go to their trading community, and then they'll go present that information through an Eskimo dance. And basically they're telling, like if someone over here has 50 cords of rope and 3 seal pokes of seal oil that they want to trade for however amount of dry fish, or this certain amount of caribou skins, the messenger will memorize all that stuff. They'll go and present that information to their trading partners, what during the collection months. This is before they go and do their trade fair, and then they'll take the responses from their trading partners, and then they'll bring them back to their trading families, so that everybody's kind of on the same page, that when they do go into these big trade fairs at the end of the fall time, um, they would already have an idea and know what to expect from each other. And that's why the messengers were so highly esteemed, is because they can run across long distances through enemies' territories when the truce is not kind of going on, and so they had a huge importance. And I'm sure that's one variation, and I'm sure other people will be able to tell us about, or tell me about, other variations of these messenger feasts. But what I'm saying is that we had extensive trade networks, strong regional ties. um, and one thing I like to out too as well, is that we were tied right into this worldwide network of trading. Like this area that we're at right here is obviously not too far from Asia. And if you look at the Silk Road, previously the Silk Road, this map kind of shows it ending like here in Japan, but I could tell you that it extended right into our people. We had direct trading with Asia. We also had a lot of trading going south, but we had more extensive trade, I think, with the Asian side, Chukotkan side. Example of that, I think 10 years ago, I was lucky to be working on this excavation outside of Shishmaref, very 15, 20 miles away from where my uncle was born. And I spent 2 summers out there, NSF funded research, great research project to be a part of. And one thing that we found in one of the houses that we were excavating 2 meters under the ground was this cast bronze buckle with horse leather on it. We got a piece of the bronze sourced. I think Brown University helped us with that, and I was just one of the students, so I was very low on the totem pole. But what was found was that this alloy, this cast bronze, was actually created over here in Eastern Asia somewhere, and then with the horse leather. But this was an old 1,200-year-old Inupiaq house. Just to give an example, we were extensively connected to the worldwide trade. Another example is when the Yankee whalers and some of those early polar explorers came up to the Arctic. People are already consuming and kind of they knew what tobacco was, and the people are already smoking tobacco, and a lot of the explorers are saying, how the heck did they get that tobacco if they don't have any anybody coming up, to trade, and they didn't really recognize the extensive trade network. What happened was that there was the European traders had come over and they started mass producing tobacco, obviously trading it into Europe. It was actually making its way all the way through the Silk Road and getting up to Alaska before any of the whalers or explorers actually made it up. So the trade network actually beat the actual humans coming around to come on, discover the age of discovery, if you want to call it that. So we have very deep archaeological evidence as well. Like we were excavating an area on our lands, on UIC lands, just 12 miles south, and it was not a real excavation. It was more of a salvage project because a lot of houses were actually falling out of the bluff and there was human remains in it and everything. So it was more of a salvage operation. We spent 2 summers out there, but you had 2 meters, 2,000 continuous years of living. The entire mound was just saturated with oil. You could tell these people were very rich, even with the tools that we had found in the floors and around the houses. Very rich people for a very long time. And if you look close enough across all Alaska, I could tell you that there's evidence of people in every last corner of Alaska. Kind of irks me when I hear, come to Alaska and step on a piece of land that has never been stepped on before. But if you look at some of the, for instance, parks websites, they do make comments like that. And it's kind of, if you look close enough, we've been here in every corner of Alaska for a very, very long time, tens of thousands of years. The importance of gifting is deeply rooted in our cultures. Like I said, sharing is very deeply rooted. Trade is very deeply rooted, but gifting is also a huge part of this. I'll give the example of, I call him my nephew, but he's one of my best friend's sons, Dede Kubani, Victor Kubani III. He was one of our hunting partners. That's who I was hunting with recently, and we do a lot of hunting, and he's always tagging along. This was way up in the Brooks Range this winter when we were wolf hunting. This was on our 11-day hunt. And this is actually a moose that he shot. This was his first moose here that we see on this caribou here. This is his grandpa, Vic Vic Senior. So what the rule in just about all the cultures in Athabascan, Inuit, is that like when you catch your first hunt, you have to give the whole thing away to the community, and that's one of the many things that that have sharing as part of our culture. Just the backstory on this, that same day, he shot this one over 300 yards, no lie. One shot. It was a very kind of you're saying a lucky shot, but he somehow caught that. But that same day, I missed one at about, I think, 60 yards. So I was really embarrassed the whole hunting trip. But anyway, he had the luck that day. He did really good, and they were kind of required to, like I said, give away their whole moose. After 11 days of hunting, we weren't lucky with the moose, and Dede wanted to give us half of the moose because he knew that we were going to kind of distribute it to people. So this whole 200, 300 pounds of meat came because Dede caught it and he was giving it away as a gift. The other half of the moose got spread out to, elders and others. But I just love the way that we just are so rooted in sharing, and sharing your first catch is like just a common rule across all the indigenous cultures. It's just like, it's not something that we made up in the last 50 or 100 years. It's something that is very, very deeply rooted. Another example is ulus, the uloks, the ulus that has become a very symbolic piece of symbolic tool to Inuit peoples. It's pretty much the semi-lunar knife that has a handle situated on top, and you're able to use your weight to kind of cut through thick blocks of muck duck or things like that. It's very simple, but it's the functional aspects are, you can't get anything better to cut through these thick, hard, frozen materials that we're kind of eating and processing. It's kind of the first step to breaking it down and processing it. It saves our teeth a little bit. But the point here is that the ulus are a way to gift for. A lot of times it's the young men and families to gift things to to a lot of times the ladies and the women that we really have a very special, that are very close to us, that we want to just show them how much we care about them. And just looking at this group of ulus, and we have some more here and there, and I'll tell you the story that this ulu right here was a gift from my dad to my oldest daughter, Kaya, pretty recently. And this is something that she'll always have and she'll always cherish, and she'll always be able to see that. And then I remember her papa. The same thing here is another food ulu was made from my dad, made for my daughter, younger daughter, my 11-year-old 10-year-old daughter. Here's a small ulu that I made with walrus cheekbone and gave. It's another one that we just use for eating. And these are kind of smaller sewing ulus. I made this one for these two for my two daughters as well. And then this one here was a gift from an elder in Shishmaref who came into Anchorage for medical, and my mother-in-law and my wife, they all kind of opened the door. They always open the door for people coming in from Shishmaref especially, and he felt so, he just felt so welcome and was so thankful. He went back and he made my mother-in-law as well as my wife and my sister-in-law matching ulus with the seal, with the ivory seal here. And this is something that we'll keep forever and I always remember and cherish. And then this one has means a lot to me. This was the elder Fred Ketchetag in Unalakleet shortly before he passed, maybe a year or two before he passed. This is probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. I had a real close relationship with Fred, and he always took me out hunting, and he made ulus for people he cared about, and he made this one for my wife, and we really hold this one a special place in our heart. So this one very functional tool here also is a very good example of how the deeply rooted sharing and gifting and showing appreciation like that. Other examples that I won't really get into are, the dance festivals, the nalukatuks, the potlatches, and the stick dances in the interior. These festivals centered around them is sharing. Like if you go there, people like the folks holding these festivals and stuff are actually just giving everybody something. It's all about giving back to the community and sharing your harvest, but then also sharing your wealth. Like you really try to put all your money in. A lot of times they're putting all their money and resources into collecting things to give to the community. And you would think that why would you do that? You're just going to give everything away and maybe you're going to go hungry later in the year. But when you think about it, when you have hundreds of people that you shared with, you can always rely on those hundreds of people sharing back with you, so you have nothing to worry about. Okay. And then I also wanted to, I asked Kunuk if it was okay if I shared just, the picture on the left and our whaling captain in Barrow. And just wanted to say how much Inupiaq whaling, how much sharing is just at the root of Inupiaq whaling and muktuk and whale meat, for instance. These, I didn't put the picture on here, and I forgot to actually about detailing how they cut up the whale, but it's just mind blowing how they have every last square inch of that big bowhead whale accounted for, and they have these just very complicated and just very meaningful ways that they cut up the whale with the orty, or the belt, and I'm going to get these mixed up, but the ningik, that where you the trading shares, everything above the belt or the belly button is all for trading. Everything below the belt on the whale for the belly button area is for the festivals. It's amazing how this trading, the structure of trading and sharing and gifting is just at the root of bowhead whaling. And for instance, 2 days ago, the crew that I'm very lucky to be a part of, Kuna crew, these are all separated bags that they're going to deliver to whaling crews, to families across the North Slope. And they all have an equal amount, the portion of muktuk, of meat, of innards, of all these things. It's a very, very complex. And this is a 365-day a year job, no lie, man. These guys put so much work and time into it, and then they share it. And to be honest, this muktuk makes its way around the world through sharing networks. All through sharing networks. None of it's being sold. Sometimes it's traded, but it's a real worldwide sharing network. We have Inuks everywhere around the world living off of muktuk. And my kind of, not really a joke, but what I always say is that the further you get away from those whaling communities, the portion gets smaller and smaller. So where you're having big bites, for instance, if you're in Barrow, you see all these muktuk and whale like 20 different ways here. But if you go like further and further and further, they get smaller and smaller, to like you're down in maybe like in Anchors or like somewhere, and you got these tiny little teeny, and it's just like enjoying it. But it's enjoyed and cherished nonetheless, I'll tell you that much. So, and one thing that I wanted to share was to reemphasize that when you're asking folks locally to ask for their observations. It's not simple questions. Like, even if you're asking a whaling captain, what did you see on this day, and asking him a bunch of questions, you might think that that's just, and then you're going to say, okay, I'll give him $100 stipend, and then thanks, I got the information. But what you're actually doing is you're entering these very complex sharing networks. Craig George, for instance, I heard him say this many times. He told me personally, it's actually quoted in my thesis as well, because but he tells people you have to recognize, and by the way, Craig George is like one of the leading wildlife biologists who lives in Barrow, and he really devoted his entire life to working with the folks up there, living in Barrow, and really co-producing knowledge. And honestly, I think they're the gold standard example in the entire world of how to really engage locally and to how to co-produce knowledge. But he said that you have to recognize you're entering a sharing network, and you're expected to share back. And he said he didn't really understand this until like 2 years after being involved in the sharing network, that people share information about observations. And that's what traditional knowledge is. Pretty much a huge aspect of traditional knowledge is this living sharing network of observations. And it crosses generations as well. You learn about the observations from your grandpa, appas, and the akas, and so there's an element of it that is that personal experience, but also a huge element of is this strong sharing network of observations. So when you're coming in and you're interviewing folks about things, just recognize that you're actually entering the sharing network, and you're going to be kind of expected to share back in different ways. And it's going to take creative thinking and really deep thinking and homework on your own end to really understand how you could potentially share back. The reason why I say there is a strength and potentially a weakness in Arctic research is what I'm referring to there is that people are so nice and accepting to share, that you might not realize that, they're not going to say no. For instance, some people are going to say no, get away, but there'll be a lot of informants or subject matter experts that you might be reaching out to that are very reluctant to say no to people or to kind of create conflict or anything. So just keep that in mind, that even though people are saying, yes, I will help you with this for free, or they don't mention anything about payment or anything, like just keep in mind that people are very open usually and accepting to bringing people in and sharing with them. And a lot of times they're not spelling it out that you have to share with me this here or there, and they're just kind of, it's just kind of an expectation that you have when you're entering these sharing networks. And I'll say that sharing science equals observations. There's a small element of sharing, at the end you share your data, you share your results, you kind of at the end publication, but there's this huge possessiveness as far as what information, and a lot of times the information that you're gathering, you have to kind of keep it in, you can't just go and give it to everyone else if you want to really make your science more valuable, I think. But the difference is that in traditional knowledge, sharing of observations starts at the very beginning, and there are no barriers or ways that they really try to separate. I'll be honest, in the villages, not everyone is like full-blown wanting to share with their neighbors. There's factionalism here and there, yes, that's true. But if you have information that you could share with people to potentially keep them safer, that's just kind of unspoken truth, that you have to kind of share that information. So briefly, I'll just briefly touch on like the old history of sharing Arctic research, and then kind of talk about this new kind of paradigm that we're going into, which everyone I'm sure is very excited about. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how this all kind of relates to what you guys are doing as far as Arctic research, and really trying to do the best job of engaging with folks. So the old history, I'll use Pete Civilic as an example. In my thesis research, I really looked at the history of engagement with locals here in Utqiagvik, or up in Utqiagvik. And I apologize for all the text. I just kind of copy pasted from a previous presentation, but I'll kind of touch on each of the topics. So Pete Civilic, if you don't know, like we had a huge research campus built up here in Barrow, or up there in Barrow, in the 1940s for oil and gas exploration. However, following World War II, they kind of pulled back from that oil and gas exploration and started, utilizing the 1,000-man campus that they built for science. And it really got turned over to the Office of Naval Research, and also UAF managed it for many, many years. but it became kind of the Cape Canaveral of Arctic research, is what it's been referred to, like the center of international Arctic research for 30 years or so. Lots and lots and lots of projects went down there. For the first 20 years or so, they really focused on the physiology of animals and kind of that aspect of it. They had a huge animal research facility, ARF. The person who was in charge of the ARF, his name was Pete Suvelik, and a crazily, amazingly gifted, smart man about the local knowledge, traditional knowledge about animals, just and this incredible ability to communicate that with scientists to the point where we had scientists in hindsight saying that throughout those 30 years, 20, 30 years, Pete trained entire generations of scientists, to the point where he was actually editing the students' reports and stuff like that. However, when you look back at this, I found a publication that lists all the publications from NARL from 1947 to 1974, a total of 4,000 contributing authors to these publications. There was only a mention of on all 2,400 publications, 3 of them listed authors as local Inupiaq consultants as authors on the reports, and those were Simon Piniak from Untitled Pass. So Pete, like, he contributed to thousands of these reports, no lie. He was like right in the middle of a lot of this stuff, to the point where, like, even in hindsight, the scientists were saying, the most definitive books on birds in the area contain so many quotes from Pete that one wonders why he wasn't the author of record. He was pretty much providing all the information, but he was never given any credit for it. It was never really mentioned in any of it, although he was really feeding a lot of the information to the scientists. That they realized very early on, the scientists at ONR realized very early on that that the Inupiaq of people of Barrow were the key to really unlocking a lot of the information about the Arctic environment and the Arctic animals. Where this quote right here from one of the founders of NARL: "Since the first summer of the laboratory's operation in 1947, we have enjoyed a unique relationship with the natives of Barrow. For most of the lifetime in the laboratory, about 60% of our employees have been hired locally. The difficulties that someone from the South 48 have in trying to accomplish the simplest chores in an Arctic winter can only be appreciated fully by those who have learned the hard way. The people of Barrow have brought experience and knowledge to the laboratory, and the value of these research efforts can never be fully measured." Part of that is because they were never given credit for any of this contributions, and it was a sign of the times, unfortunately. But we are very happy to have that history. However, we're very proud of this history, but things are changing right now. One thing that I'll mention about engagement between federal scientists or in the North Slope region particularly is kind of an ugly part of the chapter of history, but it's something that we got to kind of consider because it's still fresh in the minds of a lot of people especially the elders that are aware of the situation on the North Slope about Project Chariot. That was basically the Atomic Energy Commission wanted to test its nuclear weapon. They wanted to show that nuclear power could be used to kind of engineer our environment, blowing up deep water ports, or making a new road through mountains. They want to be able to move mountains with these atomic bombs, and they wanted to prove to the federal government that these bombs are going to be safe and it's not really going to, the fallout was the huge concern at the time, obviously the radiation. So they developed a plan to go out and blow up a new port. A lot of people know about this, but they were going to blow up a new port right near one of our most prestigious villages, Tikiak, Point Hope. A part of this was, part of the secret of this was that they wanted to test the fallout on the locals. They had already begun doing that by going out and telling folks that, hey, we're giving you this immunization, and they were actually injecting people with, it was called iodine 151, and it was low levels of radiation to see how their bodies are going to react to it. They weren't told anything about that. And if you read Firecracker Boys, you'll learn a lot about that history. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but UAF was one of their main endorsers. They endorsed the project, and they actually gave Edward Teller an honorary PhD who led that project. So I'm not sure if apology or something like that is in line, but at least it's still fresh on the minds of many people. the Federal Administrative Act of 1946 also kind of has, I would say, has had a negative impact on how federal entities engage with locals. If you whittle it down, or if you do the crunch the numbers, we have 220 million acres of federal land in Alaska. Most of it's in the rural areas, and we have about 150,000 people in those rural areas. So you have this huge, very high number of acres per person, I think, per person in the rural areas. And then all federal agencies are required to go through this comment or notify and comment process. And as far as sharing, like a lot of people will go out and kind of share their observations or share their concerns with this process. They'll go and submit comments to these public meetings and stuff. But for the most part, I feel like people have either put up a wall against these initiatives because, number one, they either were ignored in the past through all these federal notice and comment processes constantly shoved down our throats, either ignored, or our words are taken out and kind of used against us. So those are kind of the two things that people are very reluctant to engage in any kind of federal processes as far as engaging in it without. If you look at it, I think this history of this process probably has a negative impact on how locals engage with scientists, is what I'm saying. It's scientists don't have to go through this process. Obviously, things like IRPIC and those other ones, they actually do have to go through this notify and comment process before they make any big changes to the laws, or before they introduce any things like, for instance, the research plan that they're putting together. So it's just good to know about the history, learn about it a little bit more, and learn about how you can kind of work around some of those obstacles. However, we are going into, and I know that I'm getting close, Margaret. This is my second to last slide, I believe. We're going into this kind of a new paradigm, I feel like, and I would hope that people might agree with this. Is that kind of going through this period where we're, as a field of Arctic research, we're really starting to reflect on the way that our research both engages with Arctic communities, but also how it impacts Arctic communities, how we can kind of orient our research to have positive impacts on folks in the Arctic with all the stuff that people are facing, especially with the changing environment. New funding opportunities we know about, NSF NNA is a big one. Very strong initiative to engage with locals and to build projects that are centered around this engagement, which I'm very excited about. There are some growing pains that have been going on there, but I think it's going in the right direction. Where, like I said, I feel like we're at this paradigm shift. If you haven't read Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolution of Scientific Paradigm, I forget the name, but the old book that talks about kind of these shifts in paradigms. Nearly everyone means well. I think that's a very huge difference than the past. I think like just almost all scientists I ever met, like they're in it because they want to make a positive impact. So, and I know that you guys mean well here and there. There might be bad apple, but very, very rare in my personal experience. So 2020 and beyond, where currently this whole COVID thing is throwing a huge wrench in it. It's extremely complicated as far as engagement. For the last 5 years, I've been trying to find ways to create positive face-to-face engagement, pretty much bringing the scientists into our communities, engaging with folks, doing these fun field schools and stuff. But that was all put on the shelf very quickly with this whole COVID thing. So right now we're actively really trying to find creative ways to engage folks. One thing that I will say, however, that although Arctic research was almost even brought to its knees this field season, like scientists are not able to go out and do the research. Just to remind you that our living off the land, that traditional knowledge side of things, never skipped a beat. In fact, it got more important. So like we're still going to be living off the land. We're still going to be exchanging the information. We're still going to be taking those observations. So just wanted to bring just to remind folks of that. And I know that you guys are kind of facing this pressure to engage with communities, through the funding, and you might be at a point in your research where you're at this kind of standstill where you don't know where to move forward, or you don't know where to start. And that might be because you're feeling pressure from the funding, the funding part of it, to like really try to hold up to what you promised you're going to do in your proposal, for instance. Sometimes it might be a little bit over aggressive planning. Maybe you didn't really understand what it really is going to take with engaging with communities. You really meant well, but kind of it's maybe with the whole COVID thing, things have been put on, kind of stopped in your tracks. So these are kind of lists. I was just kind of brainstorming areas that you guys might be struggling with. Lack of local partners, I totally understand that, and it kind of goes to that Federal Administrative Act kind of thing, where it's been years and years and years of people always reaching out and saying, take part, take part. The thing is that I really think that we have to recognize that this era of expected volunteerism has to be over in Arctic research. We just have to put that in the past. We can't expect local volunteerism anymore. We have to really think deeply about how we're going to kind of fund those positions, or how we're going to kind of share to make it more meaningful on that end. Or you might just be very low on the picking order, aka early career. Maybe you just don't have the power to go in and say, hey, I want to do this and I want to make this part of the project. Maybe you just don't have the power to do that. And in order to, to those folks, I would say, find creative ways and kind of play to your strengths. And actually, I'll say that on the next slide, actually. And I do recognize also that the COVID problem is really throwing a wrench in all of it. And it's really, really tough. I'm in the same boat as you guys are as far as planning and engaging with our communities. So what can you do? And I apologize, these are kind of all over the map. I just threw these together very quickly, and planning early is a huge aspect of it. You would think that that's obvious, but previous models of outreach and engagement always kind of came at the end as far as broader impacts, check the box kind of thing at the end. Kaare, I'm out in Ecological, and this last day that I'm there, I really would like to can I go to the school real quick to go talk to kids, and so that kind of end of the project is a kind of a last minute add-on type of aspect of engaging with communities. I think we're really trying to move that further back into the planning process so that we're really making these as part of our field planning and really considering what it's going to take. Play to your strengths. That's a really important thing. A lot of times we get caught up with thinking about how is this little project going to relate to the community, and we overthink that too much. We got to kind of take a step back to realize that maybe start thinking about what are my strengths. I'm a great artist. I do this. I even things that might not have anything to do with your project. That might be, think of something that would like, for instance, this mural that we made here on the bottom. We had scientists who were not CI scientists, who were terrestrial scientists, we were having a little bit of trouble of trying to find that connection between what they can do and our students that we were going in to work with. And we ended up finding some that was not really connected at all to their specific project. We had the kids draw these little those little pictures of stuff that they really cared about. So we spent a day doing this art thing where they drew these little plates of really important stuff to their lives that they really cared about, 100 different fifth graders. And then we kind of brought them together to fill out this ice decline map. And then we told them that this is the positive thing that we're going to shoot for. If we really get things a hold of things right now, we can kind of shoot for this positive line. The red line, unfortunately, is the predicted if we keep going down this route. So just to find your strengths, play to those strengths. If it means that you go play basketball or do this other thing, or just try to be creative with how you engage. Share the pie. If you're able to hire locally, that's a huge thing. What I mean by share the pie is like the funding. If you're, instead of trying to bring folks in to do the work, if there's any way that you could contribute to a local hire, that's a huge thing, is kind of spreading some of that budget around and trying to find logistical ways to work people into the project, as well as at that same time kind of engaging with them about co-production knowledge type things. There's ways that you can kind of mix the two. Sharing food as a gesture of respect. We always say share food at your meetings. It's not because we want to just pay people to be there. That it's actually because that's what we do in our meetings always, is that we always share food in gatherings locally. Door prizes. People always, we know that that's kind of a local custom now. Like all of the different state entities, federal entities, local entities, everybody, when they do a meeting, door prizes are a part of it. So it's not like we're, when we're doing outreach and engagement for science, we're kind of coming in and making up this door prize thing. That's something that we're kind of just adhering to. It's like a local, almost like a local custom that has been created by all the different entities that take part in it. Support generational research. That's an important one. We know that projects, there's a huge temporality aspect to projects. We want to be able to build on previous research and not have to recreate the wheel over and over again. I think all you guys are kind of aware of that. We have a lot of people in this room that are very good at that. kind of building on previous research through their whole career. Try, people that are new to Arctic who are just kind of dropping in and doing a short project, try to understand where you fit in on that context with generational research, because there's a lot of folks that are doing very similar things, very likely. And then the move away from the binary polarizing way to think about things. If you take a Venn diagram and you say, okay, here's the native stuff and here's the science stuff, and where do we kind of overlap? This binary way of thinking about things, I really think kind of hurts the situation, because it's so much more complicated than that. You have all these different research projects that have all these different connections to all these different entities, native entities that, Alaska native entities are extremely complex, and they have different roles and responsibilities, and it takes a long time to learn that, but it's not a binary way of thing where we have two polarizing sides. So I won't go through the whole review because we probably have enough time for just a few questions. So that is the presentation that, that focuses our return and reciprocity is at the root of so much of what we do. How does that relate to Arctic science? Could be pretty tough. You got to be creative. You got to really communicate with, do a lot of communication and deep thinking, reflection. I hope I provided some guidance here, but if I left you more confused than before, then I apologize about that, but I'd be really happy to hear any questions.
Thank you so much for your talk, Kaare. That was super interesting, and thanks for also mentioning Project Jared. We might have a speaker at the end of our lecture series talking about that project specifically, and why here at UAF you might want to rethink about renaming some of the buildings that we have here. So thanks a lot for mentioning that too. We did get quite a lot of questions here, so I will relay some of them. And yeah, for everyone who joined us and who doesn't have time, I see it's 5 to 1, so thanks a lot for joining. And we will keep this channel open for a little while to answer some of the questions if you have time, Kaare. So that's of course a given. Yeah, so if you have time to stay on, then I would just relay them to you right now. And so Elizabeth asked, what are positive ways that non-native scientists have been able to reciprocate and share in the past?
I think every project is unique, and then so that our solutions and engaging with folks is almost always tailored to that specific project. I think just in general, because the answer that Andy gave last week when I asked him about what if projects are not relevant, like sea ice research and wildlife biology, for instance, are very relevant to locals. Like you can go in and just start talking about things just right off the bat, and that's what we think about all day. However, a lot of research is not that relevant to locals, and that doesn't mean that your research is not important. So how do you kind of make that stretch? It really takes creative thinking, being honest. If things and then just if the more honest you are about things, like the more organic the engagement is going to be. So for instance, if you're doing a community meeting and you're talking about something that's just way off and people are like not feeling it and it's a very weird feeling, you might say, I understand that this project is not directly relevant to your this or but here's why it is important in the big picture kind of thing. So I know that that's kind of not a direct answer, but it's just going to take being creative, being realistic, being honest with yourself about your project and its local relevancy, but then also being vulnerable, kind of going in there and kind of just letting folks know that that where you are struggling, or introduce yourself. You just try to speak from the heart and be honest, and people will see that and they'll respect that. With a vulnerability thing, you're gonna get some negative feedback from people almost always locally. Not necessarily because of who you are or your specific project, sometimes maybe, but more because of the context that you're stepping into. Like what happened in the last 50 years and their engagement with scientists, for instance, is really going to build that context. So when you go in there, just remember that I know that everyone's so passionate about their research, but try not to take things so personally, because you could easily get turned off from if someone's giving you, ugly looks or makes these real disrespectful comments that you feel, it's probably because of the context that you stepped into. It's very likely it's not because of who you are as a person. So try not to take things real personally. And I guess that's my answer.
Thanks a lot. We have another question. Are there any maps of the trade fair locations and networks you talked about earlier today?
Yeah, read Ernest Tiger Birch. He has a trilogy. One of my favorite ones is it's called Alliance and Conflict. What is it? It's called Alliance and Conflict, but it's basically talks about kind of how these traditional nations in Northwest Alaska, kind of the political side of things, on how they work together. Talks about the strong alliances that some places had and that kind of that messenger feast sort of process. But then it also talks about some of the conflicts, the deep conflicts where we had warring people and the messengers had to kind of go through those areas. So Ernest Birch, Alliance and Conflict is one that I'd point you to. Keep in mind that a lot of those social scientists they kind of at the root of things, they kind of believe in this kind of, they were taught to believe in cultural evolution and some of those earlier notions. So just kind of keep in mind that some people have these, what I call pre-theoretical commitments, that's not necessarily spelled out in the text. There's a whole bunch of good information there, but sometimes some of that older text is going to have this pre-theoretical commitments to this kind of this rhetoric that we're trying to move away from, this cultural evolution kind of thing. So just keep in mind with a lot of those resources.
Awesome, thanks. I want to open it up to everyone who's still here. If you want to ask questions directly and don't want to go through me or us, then please feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, oh yeah, Elizabeth, if you want to ask.
Yeah, so you mentioned the tobacco getting to Alaska via Asia. I'm a little surprised that it didn't previously get there, through North American trade routes. Can you comment on that, or is that what you were saying, that did not happen?
I'm sure it probably was happening more towards the eastern side of things, like over at Eastern Canada and Greenland. I'm sure that it was traded up through there. But I just know that I think when the European colonizers started producing it like on a huge wide scale, it was like much more available and actually going through all these, there's lots more to going through the trading. And I think it probably made its way, but I don't think the trading connection was as strong, quite as, I really feel like at least in Northern Alaska and Western Alaska, we had very strong ties to the Chukotkin side and that kind of network there. The Wales, the people around Wales and Diomede, and they were very famous traders. I mean, like people from all Alaska would kind of go over there for their big trade fairs until we started getting, the St. Michael is where the Russians put their first trading posts. A lot of that movement kind of in the mid 1800s started to kind of go down to St. Michael for their trading. So they'd collect all year long and then go down and trade. In fact, these traders from Kotzebue who went down to St. Michael to trade, that became regular. And then when the U.S. purchased the territory, they actually paid a lot of those guys who were traveling from Northern Alaska to settle in our region, which is a big part of the history of Unalakleet and some of the areas in eastern Norton Sound.
Thanks.
Thanks, too. And Margaret posted a lot of resources in the chat during the lecture, so we'll relay them to the website too, so you can look them up later.
It looks like Gwen might have a question if Corey still has time.
Oh yeah, if you have time. Thank you for the talk. It was really useful. I'm an early career scientist at UAF, and I was wondering, given all the difficulties with COVID, are there any opportunities for remote engagement that exist with Gatwick?
There are. I know that right now we're kind of going into a new, really big. The primary contractor for NSF is going into we're in the second month of the new primary contractor. Went from Jacobs to Battelle, and Battelle is we're organizing some really fun, cool ideas to bring forward in this coming year. However, things are still being written, but however, these tools are going to be kind of oriented to offer to a lot of the projects that we're currently under contract with. So I'm not sure if we're supporting any logistics, but they'll be, we have a ton of contracts or a ton of projects in Barrow and others that we're covering, and many of them that I see on this call. A couple of the things that we're going to offer are a new podcast series where we're interviewing folks and broadcasting it on our local radio stations, but then also making them downloadable to folks. And then we're really going to try to have more of a social media presence where we produce like 60-second introductory videos about your projects or any updates or anything to get out to folks, because we know that a large part of the bandwidth in rural Alaska goes to Facebook. And then also AM radios are like one of the main modes of communication. So we're going to really try to emphasize a couple of those modes that are COVID friendly. So regardless of people are going to be able to get out and do face-to-face engagement, we're still going to have these tools ready to implement through the next years. So you'll hear about more of those starting February 1st if you're involved in any projects that are funded, NSF funded.
We got the question if you could share those social media pages with us. So maybe after your talk, we can come back to you and then distribute them or post them on the website.
Yeah, February 1st will be when we share that information. We'll get it out to IRPICS and the networks and the ARCIS networks and this network as well. We'll try to get the word out as much as we can about that. But February 1st is the calendar for the first day of the calendar year for us.
Cool, thanks. I'm just checking the chat. Margaret, help me out if I'm.
Yeah, Sarah asked a question. Was anyone also very inspired? Oh, because she was asking to everyone. She was asking, yeah, because the salad, and just kind of thinking about if there's any other analogies, such as soup and pie. But I don't know. Is there any other questions people have?
I think I noted one more down earlier from Nicholas, who asked, for the purposes of trade, was there a high degree of multilingualism among Native communities prior to colonialization?
I think there was what we call a pidgin kind of language, I'm sure, with the traders, that they were able to communicate. And I wish I knew, this, I love the history. I haven't read some of this stuff in a while, but I do know that there was ways to enumerate what you're going to trade. Everything had a value, kind of a standardized way of how to trade certain things. So I'm sure there was either pidgin language or sign language or something that everybody kind of used. I don't have any specific information on that.
Awesome, thank you.
I think that's it. If there's no last questions, our next talk we're moving it up an hour. So next week it'll be 11 a.m. and it's an Indigenous student panel. And I'll put the RSVP in the chat. So yeah,